Laura Collins stepped out of her car, her eyes drawn immediately to the grand mansion in front of her. She hadn't seen a house like this in years, a sprawling estate with ivy-covered walls and wide, sweeping lawns, the kind you'd expect to find in an old romance movie or a forgotten magazine spread. She took a deep breath, feeling a familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. Even after decades as a nurse, something about this job felt different. A short-term contract as a caregiver wasn't unusual, but the family's secrecy was. They had only told her that the patient was a private man, needing companionship as much as physical care. The moment Laura crossed the threshold, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It was as if the air carried the memories of another time, one she couldn't quite place. The housekeeper, Rosa, greeted her warmly and guided her inside. The foyer was everything she imagined: rich wood paneling, portraits of ancestors that watched silently from the walls, and windows that framed the perfect view of lush gardens. Wealth like this came from generations, not mere years of good fortune. As Rosa led her through the winding hallways, Laura couldn't shake a growing sense of familiarity, a feeling that made her uneasy. The walls seemed to whisper secrets from the past, almost as if the house itself recognized her. Rosa paused in front of a large, polished door, resting a comforting hand on Laura's shoulder. "He's just in here, Miss Collins. I'll be right outside if you need anything," Rosa assured her, giving Laura an encouraging nod before slipping back down the hall. Laura took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and opened the door. The room was dim, softly lit by the warm glow of ambient lighting. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the half-light, and that's when she saw him, sitting in front of the window, his back to her, looking out at the gardens. "Mr. Hawthorne?" she called, her voice barely louder than a whisper. The man turned slowly, and when his eyes met hers, Laura felt her heart drop. She recognized him instantly, despite the years. Richard Hawthorne. Though time had etched lines across his face and his hair had turned silver, those eyes were the same, unmistakable and piercing. He was the man she had never fully forgotten, the man she had once loved with every piece of her heart. The shock on Richard's face mirrored her own. For a moment, he seemed frozen, confusion flickering in his eyes. He rose slowly, almost as if in a dream, and took a small, uncertain step toward her. "Laura?" he whispered, his voice catching. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She simply nodded, tears threatening to spill. It was surreal, standing here, staring at the man she had believed was gone from her life forever. "Is it really you?" Richard's voice was rough, full of disbelief. Laura swallowed hard. "Yes, Richard, it's me." They stood there, time folding in on itself, the past colliding with the present in a way that almost took her breath away. Slowly, Richard reached out, his hand trembling as though he feared she might disappear if he moved too quickly. When his fingers brushed hers, Laura felt warmth spread through her, a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The memories came rushing back. Quiet laughter, secret moments under the stars, the dreams they had built together, and how suddenly they had all been taken away. After a moment, she managed to speak. "It's been a long time." Richard nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Too long." They both took a seat, knees barely able to support them. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words, with everything they had lost. Laura tried to wrap her mind around what was happening. She had come expecting to meet a stranger, but instead, she had found the man she had once loved. "Life has a funny way of bringing people back together," Richard murmured, his voice almost lost in the stillness of the room. Laura nodded, though she struggled to find her voice. She searched his face, looking for some hint of how he felt. Richard had always been hard to read, and it was part of what had made him so intoxicating and so difficult. He had kept his emotions locked away, leaving her to guess. Now she could feel the same barriers between them, and yet there was something different in his eyes. Vulnerability. "So, you've been here all this time?" she asked. She, needing to break the silence. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been here, managing things, building a life. But..." His voice faltered, his eyes lowering. "I never stopped thinking about you, Laura." Her heart twisted painfully at his words. She had so many questions. Why had they parted so abruptly? Why hadn't he tried to find her? She remembered their final days, the confusion, the promises made in whispers. They hadn't chosen to part. Not really. She had always wondered if he had moved on, if he'd forgotten her. But now, hearing him, she realized that maybe she hadn't been alone in the heartbreak. They spoke slowly at first, sharing fragments of their lives apart. Richard spoke of the family business, his marriage, the children he had raised, the losses he had endured. Laura told him about her work, the patients who had filled the void left by his absence, and the quiet, gnawing loneliness that had settled in her heart. Each word was a bridge, bringing them closer. Gradually their conversation grew lighter. They laughed, reminiscing about old times, days spent by the lake, nights sneaking away just to be together. For a while, it was as if the years had fallen away, and they were just Richard and Laura again. There was comfort in the familiarity of it, but also an ache, a reminder of everything they had lost. But the evening began to fade, and reality started to creep back in. They had both changed. They weren't the same people who had once believed that love could conquer anything. Life had shaped them, altered them, left scars, but as Laura looked into Richard's eyes, she saw a flicker of hope, a glimpse of the man she had once loved, a man she could maybe love again. When it was time for her to leave, Laura hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Will I see you tomorrow?" she asked, her voice uncertain, almost afraid of his answer. Richard's smile was genuine this time, and a warmth spread through his eyes that gave her a sliver of hope. "Yes, Laura, I'll be here." And there, in that simple exchange, a promise was made. Not a promise to pick up where they left off, not yet, but a promise to try, to see where life would lead them this time. Laura sat on the edge of the bed in her modest apartment, her thoughts spinning as she tried to process the day's events. The quiet of the room seemed almost too stark against the storm of emotions inside her. She still couldn't wrap her mind around it. Richard Hawthorne, the man she had once loved so deeply, was not just alive but here, just a few miles away. Alone in that grand mansion, needing her after all these years. She took a shaky breath, her eyes tracing the familiar outlines of her small room. The memories of their encounter swirled around her, impossible to ignore. The next morning, Laura found herself standing in front of Richard's house again, her pulse quickening as she approached the door. Rosa greeted her with a warm smile, leading her through the now familiar hallways. Laura's heart pounded, a strange mix of excitement and fear brewing inside her as she neared Richard's room. There was so much unsaid between them, so much left unresolved. And she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. Inside the room, Richard looked up, his face lighting up as soon as he saw her. His smile was faint, but there was a genuine warmth in his eyes. They exchanged polite greetings, neither one of them quite ready to step into the deeper waters that lay between them. Laura busied herself with her tasks, preparing his breakfast, adjusting his pillows, laying out his medications. All the while she could feel his gaze on her, as if he was trying to bridge the gap between the nurse in front of him and the girl he once knew. The silence stretched, growing thicker with every moment. Finally, as she set a glass of water on the table beside him, Richard spoke, his voice breaking the stillness. "Laura, I still can't quite believe you're here." She looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat. She offered a soft smile, her eyes meeting his. "Neither can I," she said, her voice just a whisper. The words held more weight than she intended. They both knew it wasn't just about her being there as his nurse. They both hesitated, the air thick with the tension of words unspoken. There was a fear, almost palpable, that diving too deep into the past would unravel everything, that the fragile peace between them might shatter if they moved too quickly. Laura busied herself, but the memories wouldn't leave her alone. Images of stolen afternoons, laughter that echoed in places they thought belonged only to them, promises whispered under stars. She could feel it all, as vivid now as it was back then. There had been so much joy, but there had also been pain. The way they had parted was a wound she had never let herself fully feel until now. Richard watched her, and she could sense that he was fighting his own battles, his gaze lingering on her as though searching for the girl he had lost. Finally, he broke the silence again, his voice low and filled with regret. "I've thought about you so many times, Laura. I always wondered what happened to you." His words hit her hard, and she felt her heart tighten. She looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "I thought about you too, Richard. There were so many things left unresolved, things I never really understood." Richard sighed, his eyes softening. "I owe you an explanation, Laura. I know I do. For everything." They fell silent again, each grappling with emotions that had been buried for far too long. Laura looked at him, wondering just how much he remembered, how much he allowed himself to remember. Richard took a deep breath, his gaze dropping. "It wasn't by choice, Laura," he began, his voice tinged with a sadness she had never heard before. "I never wanted us to end like we did. It was never what I wanted." Laura felt a strange comfort at his words. She had always believed he had cared, but the way he had left without explanation, without a word, had made her question everything. "I always felt there was more to it," she said quietly. Richard's gaze fell to his hands, his fingers twisting together, his knuckles whitening. It was clear this truth was something that had weighed heavily on him for years. "My family, they didn't approve of us," he finally said. The words barely above a whisper. Laura froze, feeling a chill run through her. She had suspected it, of course, but hearing it now from his lips made the hurt feel fresh, as if the wound had just reopened. "They didn't think you were right for me," Richard continued, his voice strained. "They had plans for me, expectations, and He hesitated, swallowing hard. "I let them make my choices for me. I was a coward, Laura. I shouldn't have let them interfere." His words hung between them, heavy and raw. Laura felt a bitter sadness settle over her. She had spent so many years wondering what she had done wrong, why she wasn't enough. Now she realized it wasn't about her, but it didn't make the hurt any less real. "And you, Richard?" she asked, her voice trembling but stronger than she felt. "Did you ever try to find me?" Richard's eyes shot up, meeting hers. "I did," he said, his voice firm. "I went looking for you when I realized what I had lost. But by then you were already gone. You'd moved away, and I thought, maybe you'd moved on." Laura swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes stinging with tears she tried desperately to keep at bay. The years they had lost were like a weight pressing down on her. Years she had spent wondering if he had ever thought of her, if their love had meant anything at all to him. She had left the city, she had moved on with her life, but she had never truly let go of Richard. Richard seemed to see the pain in her face, and his expression softened. "If I could go back," he said quietly, "I'd change everything. I'd fight harder. I'd choose you." Laura nodded slowly. There was a sense of peace in knowing the truth, in hearing him say the words she had longed to hear for so many years. She knew they couldn't change the past. Life had molded them into different people. Yet there was something undeniably strong still between them. Maybe it wasn't the same, maybe it wasn't even meant to be what it had once been, but it was real. They spoke more after that, their words flowing more freely. Richard told her about his life, about his marriage, the children he had raised, the losses he had endured. There was a bittersweet quality to his words. A life lived that had brought joy, but also left gaps, spaces that she realized could have been filled by her. Laura shared her own stories, about the patients she had cared for, about how she had found fulfillment in helping others, but also about the quiet loneliness that had followed her, lingering in the corners of her life. Each memory, each story was bittersweet. They had lived full lives but without each other. As the sun began to set, they grew quiet, a comfortable silence settling between them. Laura felt a warmth in her heart, a flicker of something she thought had long since died. When it was time to leave, Laura stood by the door, pausing to look back at him. "Will you come tomorrow?" Richard asked, his voice almost hesitant, as if afraid of the answer. Laura smiled, a warmth spreading through her. "Yes, I'll be here, Richard." As she left, closing the door softly behind her, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of hope. It wasn't a hope for them to go back to what they once were, but for something new, something that might grow out of who they were now. Richard sat by the large window, the sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow over the room. Laura sat across from him, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. It was an awkward dance, the two of them tiptoeing around the past, but today felt different. Laura could sense it. Richard wanted to break the silence, to break down the wall that had stood between them since they had been thrust back into each other's lives. Richard turned to her, his eyes soft, filled with memories that seemed to be coming to the surface. He hesitated for a moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "Do you remember that day by the lake?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, a nostalgic smile beginning to curve his lips. "The one we managed to sneak off to, just the two of us, in the middle of nowhere." Laura's eyes brightened as the memory rushed back. Warming her from the inside, she let out a soft laugh. "I do," she said, her eyes locking onto his, glowing with nostalgia. "We had to sneak out because everyone kept telling us we weren't supposed to be together." She shook her head, her smile growing. "But I'd never felt so free." Richard nodded, a distant look in his eyes. It was a perfect day. No interruptions, no expectations, just us. He paused, his voice softening. "Sometimes I still think about that day, how everything I wanted seemed possible right then." A gentle silence settled over them, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but instead filled with shared emotions. With memories that had never lost their shine, they sat there, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the years melting away. Laura could almost feel the warmth of that day by the lake, the sun on her skin, the laughter in the air. For so long she had kept those memories locked away, but now they were vivid, alive, and they brought a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Laura shifted in her seat, her gaze dropping to her hands as she spoke. "It's strange to think of those days now," she said, her voice quiet. "It feels like we were entirely different people, and in some ways, I guess we were. We had no idea what life would throw at us." Richard nodded, his gaze lingering on her. "We were young," he said, his voice thoughtful. "And we thought we were invincible." He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of his blanket. "So much has changed since then." He hesitated again, then glanced at Laura, his expression growing serious. "I should tell you about my marriage, about how my life turned out." There was a sadness in his voice, a weight that Laura sensed he had carried alone for too long. Laura nodded, her heart tightening at the vulnerability she heard. "I'd like to hear about it," she said softly. Richard drew in a deep breath. "I did marry," he began, his voice reflective. "Her name was Catherine. She was wonderful, she was kind and patient, and she brought stability into my life." He smiled faintly, a look of fondness crossing his features, though it didn't erase the sadness that lingered in his eyes. "We had 2 children together. I loved her deeply, and I was happy in the life we built." Laura listened, a mix of emotions stirring within her. She felt relief that he had found someone to share his life with, that he had known love and joy. But there was also a pang of regret, a reminder of the life they might have built if things had turned out differently. It was a bittersweet feeling, knowing that he had lived a full life, but it hadn't been with her. "She passed away a few years ago," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cancer. It was a long, painful battle, and she was so brave through it all. I stayed by her side until the very end, but when she was gone, it felt like a piece of me went with her." Laura reached across the space between them, her hand resting gently over his. Words felt inadequate, so she said nothing. Instead, she offered him the comfort of her touch, letting him know she understood. Loss was something she knew all too well. The emptiness that followed, the feeling of being left adrift. After a long moment, Richard looked up, meeting her gaze. His eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded honesty. "Even when I had a family, even when I was happy, there was always a part of me that wondered where you were, what had happened to you. I tried to bury those thoughts, but they were always there, beneath the surface." Laura felt her heart ache at his confession. It was the kind of admission she had never dared hope for, and it both healed her and broke her heart all over again. She swallowed, her voice soft. "I never let go of you either, Richard. Not really. You were always in the back of my mind, in quiet moments. When everything else faded away, I would wonder if you were happy, if you ever thought of me." Richard's gaze held hers, and for a moment they simply looked at one another, the weight of everything unsaid between them heavy in the air. It was as if the years had been stripped away, leaving them with nothing but the truth they had hidden for so long. In that moment, there was a vulnerability between them, something raw and real that made Laura's heart pound. Richard let out a small chuckle, the heaviness lifting just a bit. "We really were quite the pair, weren't we?" he said, a wistful smile tugging at his lips. "Always sneaking away, causing trouble. I think half the town thought we'd end up married, or in jail." Laura laughed, the tension breaking for a moment. "I remember that. We always seemed to find trouble, didn't we?" They laughed together, and for a moment it was as if nothing had changed, as if they were still those 2 young lovers with the world spread out before them. The laughter faded, replaced by a softer, more contemplative silence. Richard's smile grew wistful, his eyes searching her face. "You know, if things had been different, I'd like to think we could have made it. You and me, figuring things out together. I used to imagine it sometimes. Us, finding a way." Laura's smile faltered, the weight of his words sinking in. She nodded, her voice barely audible. "I used to think about that too, what it would have been like if we'd had the chance." Their conversation drifted between memories and what-ifs, each word drawing them closer, each shared memory another brick in the bridge between the past and the present. They didn't dwell on the regrets, didn't let the pain define their conversation. Instead, they found warmth in the memories, in the laughter, in the simple joy of being together again after all this time. When it was time for Laura to leave, she hesitated, feeling the familiar ache of parting once again. Richard reached out, his hand finding hers, his grip gentle but filled with meaning. "Will you come back tomorrow?" he asked, his voice softer, tinged with vulnerability. Laura nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. "Of course, Richard. I'll be here." As she walked down the hall, the echo of their conversation still in her ears, she felt something shift inside her. There was a calmness now, a sense of something unfinished being given the chance to heal. She had come here as a nurse, but somehow she felt as though she was the one being healed. Their time together wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about finding something new amidst the ruins of what they had once been. And as she left the mansion, she realized that maybe, just maybe, they had been given the gift of a second chance. And that thought filled her with hope. Hope that, even after all these years, they could still find beauty in the broken pieces. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the fresh scent of flowers just beginning to bloom. Laura arrived at Richard's house with a sense of quiet anticipation. Sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the hallway, casting golden patterns across the polished floor, as if promising a day full of possibilities. Rosa, ever warm and welcoming, greeted Laura with a smile and led her to Richard's room. When Laura entered, she found Richard already dressed and waiting for her. His eyes lit up at the sight of her, and a smile, slightly mischievous, tugged at his lips. He gestured towards the window. "It's a perfect day outside," he said, a note of enthusiasm lacing his voice that she hadn't heard in a long time. "What do you say to a walk in the garden?" The invitation surprised Laura, but it also warmed her heart. She smiled, feeling a familiar sense of happiness bubble within her. "I think a little fresh air sounds perfect." With Rosa's help, Richard rose to his feet, and Laura offered him her arm as they made their way down the hallway and out through the back doors into the garden. As soon as they stepped outside, the scent of fresh earth and blooming flowers enveloped them, and for a moment, Laura felt like she was stepping back in time. The garden was as grand as she remembered, with winding paths bordered by rose bushes and old oak trees standing like silent guardians. They strolled together in companionable silence, each step echoing in the tranquility of the morning. Richard would pause every so often to admire a flower or gaze at one of the ancient oaks, his appreciation of the garden's beauty apparent, his eyes shining with something that went beyond simple nostalgia. "Do you remember this place?" he asked softly. His voice reflective. "We used to meet here sometimes, though always in secret." Laura nodded, a gentle smile forming on her lips. "I remember. We'd spend hours here just talking or sitting in silence." She let out a quiet laugh. "Back then, I thought this garden was magical, like nothing could touch us here." Richard looked at her, his expression tender, his eyes filled with something Laura had almost forgotten. In a way, it was magical. It felt like our own little world, a place where we could be ourselves without anyone watching. They continued walking, the air filled with the scent of roses and the gentle sound of birds singing. Richard stopped by an old stone bench, a spot they had shared many years ago. He gestured for Laura to sit, and they settled down, letting the serenity of the garden wash over them. "It's strange," he said, breaking the silence. "Being here with you again after all these years. I never imagined we'd get another chance like this." Laura turned to look at him, her heart softening at the honesty in his voice. "Neither did I," she admitted. "It feels like life brought us back here, as if to see if there's anything left for us to discover." Richard nodded, his gaze far away. "It feels right, being here with you. I miss this, having someone who understands me like you always did." Laura felt a pang of nostalgia as he spoke. "I missed it too," she replied gently. "There are things you shared with me that I've never found with anyone else." They sat quietly, letting the past and present weave together around them. It felt as though the years had melted away, leaving behind only two people who had once loved deeply and were now being given a rare chance to rekindle that connection. After a while, Richard glanced at her with quiet determination. "Laura, do you ever think about what could have been if we'd stayed together?" She hesitated, the weight of his question heavy. "I do, sometimes," she said honestly. "I think about the life we might have had, the memories we could have made." She looked away, her gaze drifting towards a cluster of roses. "But then I remember that life doesn't always go as planned." Richard reached for her hand, his touch gentle yet firm. "Do you regret it? That we didn't fight harder to stay together?" Laura looked back at him, her heart filled with a complex mix of emotions: regret, love, and acceptance. "Part of me wishes things had been different," she said softly. "But I also know we lived lives that shaped us into who we are now. I think we did the best we could with what we knew at the time." He nodded, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "You're right. I suppose there's no point in regretting what's done. We made the choices we had to make." They continued walking, the gentle crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound for a while. Richard seemed lost in thought, his gaze wandering over the garden far away. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have been braver," he murmured almost to himself. "If I could have stood up to the people around me. Maybe things would have turned out differently." Laura squeezed his hand gently. "We were young, Richard, and the world we lived in. It wasn't easy to go against what everyone expected of us." He looked at her, a faint smile on his lips. "You always knew how to make me feel better, even when I was hardest on myself." She returned his smile, warmth filling her. "I guess some things never change." They spent the rest of the morning wandering through the garden, talking about little things, the flowers, the birds, and memories of their youth. They laughed at old stories, shared quiet moments, and slowly, a sense of peace began to settle between them. The garden felt like a bridge between the past and the present, a space where they could reconnect without the burden of expectations or regrets. As they made their way back to the house, Richard paused, his gaze shifting to hers, his eyes filled with both hope and vulnerability. "Laura, I don't know what the future holds for us, but I'd like to spend whatever time I have left with someone who truly understands me, and that's you." Laura's heart swelled with emotion as she met his gaze, feeling the full weight of his words. She knew their situation was far from simple, but within her grew a quiet certainty. "I'd like that too." "Richard," she said softly. With that, they walked back to the house in silence, the beauty of the garden lingering in their hearts, and an unspoken promise forming between them, a promise of a second chance and a love that had never truly faded. Over the next few days, Laura and Richard fell into a gentle rhythm. Each morning, Laura arrived at the house, ready to help him with his daily routine. They'd chat over breakfast, and if the weather was kind, they'd go out into the garden, slowly building a bond that felt as comfortable as an old favorite song. But one afternoon, as Laura was tidying up some of Richard's books, A small envelope slipped from between the pages of an old volume. She bent down and picked it up, noticing that it was addressed to her, though the ink had faded and the paper looked aged. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't help but wonder what a letter for her would be doing here, buried in one of Richard's books after all these years. Curiosity won out over hesitation. She opened the letter carefully, unfolding the paper as she held her breath. Inside, she saw Richard's familiar handwriting. Her eyes scanned the page, taking in his words from long ago. He had written about his longing for her, how he had tried to reach her but had been unable to find her once she'd left town. There were hints of frustration in his words, mentions of the expectations placed on him and the way his family had pressured him. But beneath all that, his love for her had been clear, even then. Just as she finished reading, Richard entered the room. He looked at her, and his eyes fell on the letter in her hands. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice calm, but with a slight edge. "It was in one of your books," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know what else to say. The letter had brought old emotions rushing back, feelings she hadn't let herself touch in years. Richard seemed momentarily taken aback, his gaze shifting to the letter and back to her. "I wrote that a long time ago," he said softly, almost to himself. Laura nodded, struggling to find the right words. "Why didn't you give it to me? Did you mean to keep it hidden?" He looked at her, a sadness in his eyes she hadn't noticed before. "Laura, I tried to give it to you, but by the time I'd gathered the courage, you'd already gone. Your family told me you'd left, that you had moved on." Laura felt her heart sink. Her parents had never mentioned that he had tried to reach her, had never told her that he'd come looking for her. It felt as though they had conspired to keep her from him, from the future they might have had together. "But I thought you'd forgotten me, that you'd moved on," she said, the pain in her voice surprising even herself. "I spent years thinking you didn't care enough to come after me." Richard shook his head, his gaze intense as he met her eyes. "It wasn't like that. I cared, Laura. I loved you. But my family, they didn't want us together. They thought you weren't right for me. And I was young and I listened to them." Laura looked away, the old hurt resurfacing as the weight of his words settled over her. She had always suspected that his family hadn't approved. But hearing him say it aloud made it all so much more real. It gave shape to the pain, made it feel undeniable. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "You know, I could have understood if you'd told me back then. If you'd trusted me enough to explain why things had to end the way they did. But you just disappeared." Richard's face softened, regret etched plainly in his expression. "I thought I was protecting you by staying away. My family, they were very influential, and I didn't want them to make your life difficult. I thought letting you go would keep you safe." Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, not wanting him to see. "Maybe you were protecting me, Richard, but I think you hurt me more by leaving without an explanation. You made me think I wasn't enough." The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken apologies and unhealed wounds. Neither of them seemed to know how to bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between them, a stark reminder of the years of pain and separation that had never been properly addressed. Richard reached out, his hand covering hers in a gentle, tentative gesture. "I'm so sorry, Laura. I should have been braver. I should have fought harder for us." Laura glanced at him, her expression softening as she took in the vulnerability in his face. She could see how much he meant it, the regret pooling in his eyes. "I forgive you, Richard, but I just need time to process everything. This is a lot to take in." He nodded, a look of understanding passing over his features. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, waiting." She managed a small smile, though her heart still ached. Rising from her seat, she left the room. The letter clutched tightly in her hand. The past had been laid bare, and she needed space to think, to let these old memories settle without overwhelming her. She knew one thing for certain: once some truths were uncovered, they could never be hidden again. And perhaps that was the first real step towards moving forward. A few days passed in a tense silence between Laura and Richard. Though they still spent their mornings together, sharing breakfast and short conversations, a certain distance lingered. Laura could feel the weight of their unresolved feelings, the layers of secrets that had only begun to unfold. She carried a quiet hurt with her, a mix of betrayal and sadness. She knew Richard's confession hadn't been easy, but facing the truth had left her with more questions than answers. One afternoon, as she was organizing some papers in his office, an unexpected visitor arrived. Richard's old friend, Charles, entered the room, dressed in a tailored suit and carrying himself with the air of someone used to commanding attention. Charles was a man of few words, but had always been close to the Hawthorne family. Laura remembered him vaguely from years ago, when she and Richard were young and in love. "Charles," Richard greeted him with a firm handshake, smiling warmly. "It's been too long." Charles smiled back, his gaze drifting briefly to Laura. "I didn't expect to see you here, Richard. And who might this be?" he asked, a look of polite curiosity on his face as he regarded Laura. Richard paused, his expression softening. "This is Laura Collins, an old friend of mine." For a brief moment, Charles's face betrayed a flicker of recognition. He extended his hand toward Laura, a polite but somewhat wary smile on his face. "Ah, Laura Collins. Of course." Laura accepted his handshake, a faint unease settling in as she noticed the way his gaze lingered on her, as if he was sizing her up, remembering things he perhaps didn't want to. Charles turned back to Richard, and they began discussing matters of business. Leaving Laura to finish organizing in silence, she moved to a corner of the room, pretending to focus on her work, but her ears caught snippets of their conversation. After a few minutes, Charles's voice softened, and Laura noticed him lowering his tone, as if trying to keep her from hearing. "Richard, it's strange to see her back after all this time. I remember your family was quite insistent about keeping you two apart back then." Laura's hands froze mid-motion as she felt the blood drain from her face. She forced herself to keep working, trying to remain inconspicuous as she listened, her heart pounding with each word. "Yes, they were," Richard replied, his voice low and a hint of regret slipping in. "I wish things had been different." Charles gave a faint nod, glancing toward Laura with a cautious look. "It's funny how things turn out, isn't it? You tried to find her all those years ago, and now she's here, right when you need her most." There was a pause before Charles spoke again, his voice tinged with something between pity and judgment. "I only hope she's here for the right reasons this time. I would hate to see you hurt again." Richard's expression grew serious, his gaze moving from Charles to Laura. "She has never given me a reason to doubt her." Charles gave a tight smile, his words softened but still pointed. "People change, Richard. Just remember that not everyone has your best interests at heart." Laura felt a pang of indignation rising within her. She had come here to help, to care for a man she had once loved deeply, not to be scrutinized or judged by someone who barely knew her. Charles's words stirred an anger she hadn't felt in years, a reminder of the way she had been treated all those years ago. As Charles continued speaking, Laura sensed he wasn't just reminiscing. His words had an underlying edge, as though he were subtly warning her or reminding Richard of his family's long-standing distrust. When Charles finally left, Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She felt emotionally exhausted, a mix of anger and sadness bubbling within her. After a few moments of silence, Richard looked up at her, a hint of guilt in his eyes. "I'm sorry for what he said, Laura. I didn't mean for you to hear that." Laura met his gaze, her voice calm but tinged with sadness. "Why didn't you tell me more about your family's feelings, about the things they said?" Richard hesitated, seeming unsure of how to respond. "Back then, I thought I was protecting you," he said softly. "I thought if I kept you away from all of that, from them, you'd be happier." Laura took a deep breath, letting her words settle as she spoke. "Maybe you thought it would protect me, Richard, but the truth is, it only made me feel abandoned. I didn't know you were trying to reach me. I didn't know you were pushed into keeping secrets." He took a step closer. His face softened with regret. "I'm so sorry, Laura. I wish I could go back and change everything, but all I can do now is try to make things right." Laura looked down, struggling to process her emotions. Hearing those things from Charles brought it all back. The way they looked at me, the way they made me feel like I wasn't good enough. Richard reached out, taking her hand gently. "You were always more than enough, Laura. My family didn't see it, but I did. And I still do." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, embarrassed by her sudden vulnerability. "I don't know if I can just forget it all, Richard. There's a part of me that still feels hurt. Still feels like I'm not the person they thought was good enough for you." He held her gaze, his expression firm. "Laura, you are more than enough. And if they couldn't see that, it was their loss." She managed a faint smile, her heart aching but feeling a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Richard. I needed to hear that." They stood in silence, letting the moment settle between them. It was a quiet, fragile peace, but one that felt real, a step toward healing the wounds of the past and building something honest together. Though they both knew that the past couldn't be rewritten, they felt a renewed strength to face whatever lay ahead. Laura felt the sting of Charles's words lingering long after he left. She spent the next few days in quiet contemplation, avoiding deep conversations with Richard and keeping her distance. Though she didn't want to admit it, she was struggling to shake off the sense of inadequacy that his visit had reignited. Each day, she forced herself to push those feelings aside. But the memory of his judgmental gaze lingered. One morning, Richard called her into his study. He was sitting by the window, his hands resting on an old leather-bound photo album on his lap. His expression was gentle but serious, and Laura could tell he wanted to share something important. "Laura," he began, his voice steady, "I've been doing some thinking. After everything Charles said, I realized there's something I've been avoiding for too long." Laura felt a flicker of worry as she sat down beside him. "What is it, Richard?" He took a deep breath and opened the album, flipping through a few pages before pausing on a photo of his family, his parents, brothers, and him as a young man standing in front of the family home. "This is where it all began," he murmured, tracing a finger along the edges of the photo. "The expectations, the control, the belief that our lives were theirs to shape." Laura studied his face, the pain and regret in his eyes. "I know they wanted what they thought was best for you," she said carefully, "but they didn't see that you were your own person, with your own dreams." Richard nodded, his gaze drifting to another photo, a picture of his mother, her face stern and proud. My mother always had a strong influence over me. She wanted to shape me into someone who would carry on the family's legacy, no matter the cost, and part of that meant choosing who I could and couldn't love. Laura reached out, resting her hand over his. I'm sorry, Richard. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. He sighed, looking down at their intertwined hands. You were the one person who made me feel free, Laura, and that's why my family tried so hard to separate us. They saw the way you brought out a side of me they couldn't control. For a moment they sat in silence, both absorbing the weight of his words. Laura could sense that there was something more he wanted to say, something he was struggling to put into words. Laura, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, I think it's time I finally let go of my family's control over my life. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left living under the shadow of their expectations. She looked at him, surprised by the strength and vulnerability in his gaze. What does that mean for us, Richard? He took a deep breath, his expression resolute. It means that I want to make my own choices now, without the weight of their approval or disapproval. And one of those choices is you. Laura felt her heart swell at his words. But she couldn't ignore the doubt that lingered. But Richard, I've spent so many years feeling like I didn't belong in your world. I don't know if that feeling will ever go away. Richard turned to face her, his eyes filled with sincerity. Then let's create our own world, Laura, one that's free of all those expectations and judgments. It's not too late to build something just for us. She let his words sink in, the thought of a future without the weight of the past pulling at her. It sounds wonderful, but is it really possible to leave it all behind? Richard nodded, his gaze unwavering. It's possible if we both want it. We've spent too long letting others dictate our lives. Maybe it's time we finally lived for ourselves. They sat in quiet understanding, feeling a renewed sense of hope between them. The idea of a future together, a future built on their own terms, felt both exhilarating and terrifying. But in that moment, Laura realized she was ready to try. Richard reached for her hand, his touch warm and comforting. Will you take that step with me, Laura? A smile softened her face as she looked into his eyes. Yes, Richard, I will. In the following days, Laura and Richard grew closer, finding comfort in the simplicity of each other's presence. Their conversations became warmer, and they spent more time discussing not only their shared past, but also dreams for the future. There was a growing sense of peace between them, as if they were finally healing from old wounds. One quiet afternoon, while Richard was resting in his room, Laura found herself alone in his study. She looked around, taking in the familiar scent of old books and polished wood. Her eyes wandered to the desk, where stacks of letters and papers were arranged neatly. She hesitated, feeling like an intruder, but something drew her toward the letters. As she gently lifted one of the stacks, a small, aged envelope slipped out. Her breath caught as she noticed her own name written on it in a familiar handwriting. She carefully picked it up, realizing this was another letter from Richard, one she had never received. Curiosity and a sense of unresolved longing filled her as she opened the envelope. Unfolding the fragile paper, the letter was dated from many years ago, around the time they had first parted ways. Her hands trembled slightly as she read Richard's words, the words of a young man whose heart had been torn by the demands of his family and the love he felt for her. In the letter, Richard poured out his heart, apologizing for the way things had ended between them. He wrote about the pressure he felt, the guilt, and his regret. He expressed his hope that one day they might find each other again, though he feared it would be impossible. It was a letter of love, full of pain, but also of a quiet hope that somehow they might have another chance. As Laura read the letter, tears filled her eyes. She could feel the heartbreak he had gone through, the loneliness of loving someone and being told that love was wrong. She sat down, absorbing the letter's every word, feeling the emotions he had carried all these years. It was as if she was speaking to the young Richard, feeling the love they once shared and realizing how deeply he had cared. Lost in thought, she didn't hear Richard come into the room until he softly cleared his throat. She looked up, surprised and a bit embarrassed to be caught with his letter in her hands. "Richard," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I found this letter you wrote me so long ago." Richard looked at the letter in her hands, a soft expression crossing his face. He nodded, walking over to sit beside her. "I wrote that not long after you left. I didn't know if you'd ever see it." Laura looked at him, her eyes filled with questions. "Why didn't you ever send it? Why did you keep it all these years?" He sighed, his gaze distant. "After you left, I felt lost. My family told me you'd moved on, that you didn't want anything to do with me anymore. I thought if I wrote everything down, it would somehow help me let you go. But it didn't. I kept that letter because part of me always hoped you'd come back." Laura felt the weight of his words, realizing how much they had both suffered in silence. She reached out, placing her hand over his, her voice gentle. "I never stopped thinking about you, Richard, even after I tried to move on. There was always a part of me that wondered if you ever regretted it." He met her gaze, his expression softening. "There wasn't a day I didn't regret it, Laura. But I thought I'd lost you forever. I didn't think I had the right to interfere in your life anymore." They sat in silence, each processing the years of missed opportunities and the pain they had carried. Laura looked back at the letter, then at Richard, a new sense of understanding filling her. "We lost so much time, Richard," she said softly. "But maybe we've been given a second chance now. Maybe that's what this is. A chance to finally put the past to rest and find some happiness together." Richard nodded, his hand holding hers tightly. "If you're willing, Laura, I'd like nothing more than to spend whatever time we have left together." A smile broke through her tears, and she nodded, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "I am, Richard. I don't want to let anything keep us apart anymore." They stayed there, letting the moment sink in. The letter lay between them, a reminder of their past, but also a symbol of the love that had endured despite everything. They knew they couldn't change the years they had lost, but they could choose to embrace the time they had now. For the first time in decades, they felt free to love each other without restraint. No longer bound by the expectations or fears of the past. In that quiet room, surrounded by the memories of what once was, they found hope in the future they could still share. The next morning, Laura arrived at the house early, finding Richard already waiting for her on the patio, wrapped in a cozy blanket as he enjoyed the warmth of the morning sun. His face lit up as she approached, a warm, familiar smile brightening his features, and Laura couldn't help but feel her heart swell in response. "Good morning, Laura," he greeted her, his voice soft but brimming with warmth. "Good morning, Richard." She returned his smile, feeling a familiar flutter of joy in her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Sitting beside him, she took a moment to enjoy the quiet beauty of the garden, with its lush greenery and blooming flowers casting a peaceful aura around them. The birds sang softly in the distance, adding to the tranquility of the moment. As they sipped their tea in comfortable silence, Richard suddenly spoke, his tone thoughtful. "Laura, would you take a walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Surprised but intrigued, Laura nodded. She offered her arm, and together they strolled through the winding paths of the garden. The crisp morning air enveloped them, the soft rustling of leaves adding a quiet rhythm to their steps. After a few minutes, Richard led her to a secluded area at the far end of the garden. Here, an old stone bench sat beneath a towering oak tree, surrounded by a patch of wildflowers that seemed untouched by time. She recognized the spot immediately. It was a place where they'd often sat as young lovers. Hidden away from the eyes of the world, the memories of stolen kisses, whispered promises, and the dreams they had shared flooded her mind. She felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her, as though all those long-forgotten emotions had suddenly found their way back to her heart. "Do you remember this place?" he asked. His voice barely a whisper, filled with a touch of vulnerability. Laura nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "Of course I remember. This was our little world, our sanctuary." Richard smiled, his gaze distant as he looked around. "I haven't been back here since we parted ways. Somehow it didn't feel right to come here without you." They sat on the bench, letting the silence speak for them. The years they'd spent apart seemed to melt away as they allowed the memories to resurface, each one flickering to life in their minds like an old photograph. Laura felt herself transported back in time, as if they were once again young and hopeful, dreaming of a future together. After a while, Richard took her hand in his grip warm and steady. "Laura, I know we can't change the past, but I hope we can make up for the lost time now." She looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and longing there. "I'd like that, Richard. I'd like that very much." They continued talking, sharing memories and laughter as they reminisced about their youthful days. They spoke of their first meeting, the nervous excitement that had crackled between them, and the favorite places in town where they used to spend time. As Laura listened to Richard recount these cherished memories, she felt a sense of freedom, as if the burden of the past was finally lifting from her shoulders. Remembering wasn't painful anymore. It was a release. At one point, Richard grew quiet, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You know, Laura, I used to imagine what our life would have been like if we had stayed together. Sometimes I would picture us with a family, a little house with a garden like this one, a life filled with love and laughter." Laura felt a bittersweet ache in her chest at his words. She had imagined that life countless times herself. "I thought about it too, Richard," she admitted, her voice a little shaky. "I often wondered what it would have been like to grow old together, to share those simple, everyday moments, the kind that mean everything." They sat in silence, both lost in the vision of what might have been. But as they looked at each other, a quiet understanding passed between them. They couldn't rewrite the past, but they could cherish what they had now. After a while, Richard squeezed her hand gently. "We may have lost those years, but we still have time, Laura. Time to make new memories, ones that are just ours." Laura's smile was warm, filled with hope and a renewed sense of purpose. "Yes, Richard, let's make the most of it." The rest of the morning passed in a peaceful rhythm as they walked through the garden, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything, and by the time they returned to the house, they both felt lighter, like they had left the weight of the past under the old oak tree, letting it stay behind them. As they entered the house, Richard turned to her with a hopeful smile. "How about a fresh start, Laura? Just us, here and now." Her heart swelled with joy and she nodded. "I would love that." In that moment, they made an unspoken promise to cherish the time they had left, letting go of regrets and choosing to live each day with gratitude and love. It was a fresh beginning, a chance to create new memories together, built on the foundation of their old love, but stronger because of everything they had endured. And as they stood there, hand in hand, they both knew that their best days were still ahead of them, because this time they would be facing them together. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky with shades of rose and amber. Laura stood in the kitchen, watching the first light spill across the garden. Today felt different, like a day meant for something special, a day meant for a memory worth keeping. She knew Richard's health was fragile, and moments like these could no longer be taken for granted. She was determined to create a beautiful memory, one that would stay with both of them forever. Laura set to work, preparing breakfast with extra care. She arranged his favorite pastries on a tray, sliced fresh fruit, and brewed his favorite tea. As she worked, she hummed a soft tune, her heart warming with the hope that today would bring a spark of joy. Something to lift Richard's spirits. She knew they couldn't ignore the shadow of his condition, but today she wanted them to share something meaningful. With the tray in hand, Laura walked quietly to Richard's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see him sitting by the window, bathed in the soft glow of the morning light. His gaze was distant, his eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon. As she approached, his eyes flickered to her, and a soft smile touched his lips. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, his voice a little hoarse, but still filled with warmth. Laura smiled, her heart fluttering at the simple endearment. "Good morning, Richard. I brought breakfast. I thought today we could do something special." Richard raised an eyebrow, curiosity mingled with amusement. "Special? What did you have in mind?" She set the tray down on the small table by his chair and took a seat beside him. "How about a picnic right here in the garden? Just the two of us, like old times." She paused, her voice softening. "I think we could use a little bit of magic today." Richard looked at her, his eyes shimmering with emotion. He reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You always know how to make even the smallest moments feel like magic." "Laura, a picnic sounds perfect." A couple of hours later, Laura had everything ready. She spread a blanket under the large oak tree in the garden, the very same tree where they had shared so many memories in their youth. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns across the ground. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the distant hum of bees added a lazy rhythm to the morning. With Rosa's help, Laura brought Richard out into the garden. He moved slowly, but his smile was bright, and his eyes held a spark that had been absent during the last few days. He settled down on the blanket, and Laura sat beside him, her heart swelling with joy to see him outside, to see him smile despite everything. They talked as they ate, their conversation flowing easily from light-hearted stories to cherished memories. They spoke about the silly moments of their youth, like the time they had almost been caught sneaking out of a party just to steal a moment alone, and the times they had comforted each other when the world seemed too harsh. Laura found herself laughing more than she had in years, and Richard's laughter, though weaker, was genuine and filled with warmth. At one point, a comfortable silence fell between them, and Richard leaned back, his eyes on the sky above. "Do you think, Laura, that if things had been different, we would have been happy?" he asked. His voice soft, almost wistful. Laura turned to look at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his gaze. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair away from his forehead. "I think we would have been. But you know what, Richard? I think we still can be. Even now, happiness isn't about how much time we have, but how we spend the time we're given." He looked at her, his eyes brimming with emotion. "You always did know how to make sense of the things I could never understand," he whispered. He paused, taking her hand in his thumb brushing against her skin. "I love you, Laura. I've always loved you. Even when I thought I'd lost you forever." Laura felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I love you too, Richard. And I'm here now. We're here now. That's what matters." They stayed like that for a moment, holding on to each other, the world around them fading into the background. It was as if time had stopped, leaving just the two of them, wrapped in a bubble of love and hope. The past no longer mattered, and the future was uncertain. But this moment, this was theirs, untarnished and perfect. The rest of the day was spent basking in the warmth of the sun, sharing stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. Richard grew tired in the late afternoon, his eyes heavy, but his smile never left his face. Laura helped him back to his room, settling him in his bed, her heart full and aching all at once. As she pulled the blanket over him, he caught her hand, his eyes half closed but filled with a gentle light. "Promise me, Laura," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Promise me you'll remember today, no matter what happens." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and she leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "I promise, Richard. I'll remember today, always." He smiled, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep. His hand still holding hers, Laura sat by his side, watching the rise and fall of his chest, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Today had been a gift, a day untouched by the weight of illness or the fear of what was to come. It was a day filled with love, laughter, and the quiet joy of simply being together. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the room, Laura knew that no matter what lay ahead, they had this day. A perfect day, a memory that would stay with her forever, a reminder of the love that had endured the trials of time and separation. For Laura, it was enough. It was more than enough. In the days that followed their walk down memory lane, Richard and Laura became nearly inseparable. They found solace in each other's company, and for the first time in years, Richard's spirit seemed lighter, his laughter more frequent. There was a renewed brightness in his eyes, a spark that had been dimmed by the burden of years past. It was as if he had been given a second chance, and he was determined to embrace it fully. But one morning, Laura arrived at the house to find Rosa, the housekeeper, waiting for her in the entryway, her face lined with worry. She hurried over, her voice low and anxious. "Miss Laura, Mr. Richard isn't feeling well today," Rosa said, her eyes downcast. "He had a faint spell earlier. The doctor has already been called." Laura felt her heart drop, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. She hurried up the stairs, her mind racing with worry. The sight of Richard lying in bed, pale and drained of his usual warmth, struck her like a blow. His face was drawn, and his breath was shallow. It was a stark contrast to the man who had laughed with her under the old oak tree just days before. "Richard," she whispered, approaching his bedside, her voice trembling. His eyes opened slowly, and he gave her a faint, weary smile. "Laura, I'm sorry," he murmured. His voice barely a shadow of what it had been. The strength she had come to rely on was fragile, as if it might slip away at any moment. "Shh. Don't apologize," she replied, taking his hand gently in hers. She could feel how cold his fingers were, and she held them as if she could pass her warmth into him. "I'm here, and that's all that matters now." The doctor arrived shortly afterward, his face serious as he examined Richard. He checked his pulse, listened to his breathing, and asked him a series of questions in a hushed tone. Laura stood by, her hands tightly clasped, feeling the anxiety swirl within her like a storm. Once the examination was over, the doctor pulled Laura aside, his expression grave but calm. "Mr. Hawthorne's condition has weakened significantly," he explained softly. "He needs rest, complete rest. No more long walks or anything too strenuous. His heart is fragile and we need to be very careful." Laura nodded. Swallowing the lump that had formed in her throat, a mixture of sadness and determination settled within her. She knew Richard wouldn't take well to being confined, that he would hate the idea of being treated as though he were helpless. But she also knew she would do whatever it took to protect him, to keep him by her side for as long as possible. Over the next few days, Laura stepped into her role as his caregiver more fully. She monitored his medication, cooked nutritious meals, and sat by his bedside, reading aloud from his favorite books, her voice a soothing presence in the room. Their conversations turned softer, filled with unspoken fears, but also unyielding hope. They spoke of their shared memories and whispered about the future, however uncertain it might be. One afternoon, as she sat beside him, Richard reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it found hers. "Laura, if this is all the time we have left, I want you to know that you've brought me more joy than I ever thought I would feel again." Laura's eyes filled with tears, her voice catching in her throat. She leaned closer, her hand holding his tightly. "Don't say that, Richard. We still have time. We have today and tomorrow, and as many tomorrows as we can make together." He smiled, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, his fingers brushing her cheek. "I know, my love, but I just want you to hear it now, while I can still say it." His voice cracked slightly, his vulnerability raw and unguarded. "You've always been the love of my life, Laura. Even when we were apart, even when I thought I'd never see you again, you were always there. In my heart." Laura felt her tears spill over, and she pressed her forehead to his, her heart aching with love and sorrow. "And you've always been mine, Richard. No matter what happens, we'll always have each other." They stayed like that for a moment, the world beyond the room fading into insignificance. In that quiet space, they held each other's gaze, the love between them palpable and deep, a bond that neither time nor illness could break. In the days that followed, Richard's health became a delicate balance, a dance between hope and the realities of his frail condition. On some mornings he was brighter, his humor intact as he shared stories of his younger years, moments that brought warmth and laughter to the room. But on other days, he seemed exhausted, as if each breath was a weight he had to bear alone. Laura was always by his side, her devotion unwavering, her presence his constant anchor. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting the room in a soft amber glow, Laura sat beside him, her fingers gently stroking his hair. Richard looked at her, his gaze soft and wistful. "Laura, if I had one wish, it would be to have had more time with you, to share all those little moments we missed." Laura's heart ached, but she smiled, her eyes filled with tears that glistened like the fading light outside. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "We're making the most of the time we have now, Richard, and that's what matters. Every day with you is a gift, one that I will cherish for the rest of my life." He nodded, his eyes closing as he took a deep breath, his hand resting over hers. "Thank you, Laura, for loving me, for staying even when it got hard." Laura blinked back her tears, her heart swelling with love and determination. There's nowhere else I'd rather be, Richard. You're my heart, and I'm here. Always. In the quiet of the evening, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Laura watched over him, her heart filled with both the immense joy of their love and the bittersweet acceptance of their fragile reality. She knew that every moment was precious, that time was a gift to be treasured. And she vowed to hold on to each second they had, knowing that their love was worth every heartache, every tear, and every struggle. As Richard drifted off to sleep, Laura whispered softly, her voice steady despite the emotions that swirled within her. "Sleep well, my love. I'll be here when you wake." And as she watched him rest, she knew that come what may, their love was enough. It had carried them through the darkest of times and had given them light when they needed it most. It was a love that had transcended the years they'd lost, and it would continue to shine, even in the face of the unknown. For Laura, that was more than enough. It was everything. In the days that followed their walk down memory lane, Richard and Laura became nearly inseparable. Each day was a mosaic of shared moments, some bright with laughter, others shadowed with the knowledge of fleeting time. But there was also an undeniable beauty in the fleetingness. Each second felt precious, a gift they cherished as it unfolded. One morning, Laura arrived at the house to find Rosa, the housekeeper, wearing a gentle, understanding expression. Rosa nodded to Laura, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Richard is waiting for you in the garden. He's been asking for you since dawn." Laura found Richard sitting on the patio, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over his face. He seemed peaceful, the weight of the past days etched gently into his features, giving him an almost ethereal presence. "Good morning, my love," Richard greeted, his voice weak but filled with warmth. Laura smiled, moving closer to him. "Good morning, Richard. How are you feeling?" "I'm ready, Laura," he replied with a tender smile. "Ready to take this day as it comes. I think I've learned that each morning is a miracle, as long as you're beside me." They sat in a comforting silence for a while, listening to the birds sing, feeling the soft warmth of the sunlight as it touched their skin. Laura relished these tranquil moments, holding them close as if they were fragile glass ornaments. Later that afternoon, as Laura prepared his lunch, Richard motioned for her to come closer. His gaze, though weary, held that familiar twinkle, the one that had captivated her all those years ago. He reached out for her hand, his touch soft but unwavering. "Laura," he began, his voice a mix of strength and vulnerability. "There's something I need to say." She sat beside him, her heart tightening as she recognized the gravity in his tone. "Richard, you don't have to push yourself." "No." "Please let me speak," he said gently, his eyes locking onto hers, a tenderness reflecting every emotion he could no longer put into eloquent words. "We can't change the past, and we can't control what happens tomorrow. But here now, I want you to know something that transcends time. I love you. Laura, with all that I have, with every breath I can give. And when I'm no longer here, my love will still be yours. It's the one thing that will never fade, no matter what happens." A tear escaped down Laura's cheek as she tried to absorb the depth of his words. There was a rawness in them, an honesty that struck at her core. She leaned in, her forehead brushing against his as she whispered, "Richard, you are my everything. You've shown me that love, real love, isn't about time lost or regrets. It's about choosing each other again, every day. And I promise you, I'll carry you in my heart always." He gave her a gentle smile, his eyes closing for a moment as if savoring the purity of that exchange. That's all I needed to hear. From that moment on, Their days were filled not with conversations about what could have been, but with the quiet celebration of the now, of every breath they shared, every lingering glance, every gentle touch. Laura learned to measure time not by hours or days, but by moments, the way Richard's laughter filled the room when she shared a story, the way his hand fit perfectly into hers when they sat beneath the oak tree. One crisp evening, Richard asked to be taken outside, back to their special spot under the old oak tree. Laura hesitated, worrying about his strength, but he smiled at her in that familiar, reassuring way. "Please, Laura," he murmured. "I want to be among the stars with you." Carefully, she helped him wrap up in his blanket, and with gentle, cautious steps, they made their way through the garden to that secluded place where so many memories had been born. The stars were bright that night, their light piercing through the darkness like thousands of silent witnesses to the love they had nurtured. Richard leaned his head back, looking up at the sky. "Do you see them, Laura?" he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Each of those stars, they're like the moments of our lives. Some bright, some dim, but all of them real and all of them ours." Laura looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She nodded. "And like those stars, our love will be there forever. Even if we can't see them, we'll always know they're shining somewhere, won't we?" He turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting hers, filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. "Yes, Laura, always." They sat under the vast night sky until Richard grew tired. She helped him back inside, her heart aching at how frail he felt against her, but filled with gratitude for each second they had spent beneath those stars. There was something indescribably beautiful in their shared vulnerability, a realization that love was both the strongest and the gentlest force she had ever known. The next days took on a sacred rhythm. The mornings were spent quietly sipping tea, the afternoons reading books aloud or simply holding each other's hands as music played softly in the background. And though Richard grew weaker, Laura could still see the light in his eyes whenever they met hers, a silent acknowledgement that their love had not been defeated by time. In the early hours of a quiet morning, as the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the room, Laura sat by Richard's bedside. His breathing had grown shallow, each breath a struggle, yet his face was peaceful. He opened his eyes and looked at her, his lips curling into a faint but unmistakable smile. "Forever, Laura," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but clear enough to etch itself into her heart. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against his forehead. "Forever, Richard," she whispered back. And in that tender moment, with the promise of a new day beginning to unfold beyond the window, Richard took his last breath. His eyes closed, his hand resting in hers as the dawn light bathed them both in a gentle warmth. Like a benediction, Laura remained by his side, feeling the weight of his hand in hers. She knew that though his physical presence had faded, the essence of Richard, the love they had shared, the memories they had created, would never leave her. It was not an ending, but a continuation, a promise that stretched beyond the bounds of time. As the first birds began to sing their morning song, Laura lifted her eyes to the window. The sky was painted in hues of pink and gold. A new beginning. She took a deep breath, feeling Richard's love within her, stronger than ever. She knew she would carry him in her heart through every sunrise, through every quiet evening, through every starlit night. His love was her forever, a promise that transcended time, unbroken, unending. In the days following Richard's passing, Laura felt an emptiness that was both profound and strangely peaceful. She missed him deeply, his laughter, the warmth of his presence. The way he'd gently hold her hand as they shared stories and dreams. Yet amid the aching void of loss, there was a quiet joy, a feeling of completeness she hadn't known she needed. Their love had come full circle, and she was grateful for every moment they had reclaimed together. Laura chose to remain in Richard's home for a while longer, filling her days with small rituals that kept him close. Each morning, she would walk through the garden, pausing beneath their old oak tree, the place where they had shared so many promises. She could still feel his presence there, could hear the echo of his voice in the rustle of the leaves. Those quiet moments became her sanctuary, a way to honor the life they had rebuilt. The love that had not only survived but thrived against all odds. One morning, as Laura admired a single rose that had just bloomed, a perfect, soft pink flower that seemed to embody the beauty of new beginnings, Rosa approached her. The housekeeper's eyes were gentle, her smile tender as she held out a worn, leather-bound notebook. "Mrs. Laura," Rosa said softly, "I think you might want this. Mr. Richard wrote in it from time to time. I believe he meant for you to find it." Laura took the notebook carefully, her fingers tracing the worn cover. She hadn't known about this notebook, but the weight of it in her hands felt like a final gift from him, a way for Richard to stay close. Even now, it was as though he had known she would need these words to guide her through the days without him. Later that afternoon, Laura opened the notebook, her heart swelling as she saw Richard's familiar handwriting filling the pages. She read each entry slowly, savoring his words. There were letters addressed to her. Stories he'd never shared, reflections on their time together. Each page was like a window into his heart, filled with love, longing, and an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the time they had found together once more. One of the last entries caught her breath. "Laura, my love, you brought a light into my life that I thought I had lost forever. You showed me that love is timeless, that it lives beyond years, beyond circumstance. Wherever I am, wherever you go, know that a part of me is always with you, just as you will always be a part of me." Tears blurred her vision as she closed the notebook, holding it close to her chest. In those words, she could almost hear his voice, feel his presence, as if he were there, sitting beside her. His words were a balm, a reminder that their love was not bound by the limitations of the physical world. It transcended time, existing now as a part of her, always. In the weeks that followed, Laura slowly began to resume her life. Though it was a life forever changed. She traveled to the places they had once dreamed of visiting together, carrying Richard's memory with her to every new horizon. She painted the landscapes he had described to her, each brushstroke a tribute to him, filling her canvases with the colors of their love. In these acts, she felt his presence. He was in every sunset she watched, in every breeze that swept through the fields, in every star that twinkled above. Every evening, Laura would sit by the window with Richard's notebook, reading his words as the sun dipped below the horizon, letting his love fill the quiet spaces of her heart. She found solace in his reflections, in the simple but profound truths he had left for her. The grief was still there, but it was no longer sharp. It was softened by the warmth of their memories, by the gratitude she felt for the love they had shared. As time passed, Laura found herself sharing Richard's story with others. She spoke of love and loss, of the beauty in second chances. Friends, family, and even strangers found comfort in her words. She became a source of strength to those who had lost hope. Her story with Richard, a testament to the endurance of love, the resilience of the human heart. It became her purpose, a way to honor Richard, to celebrate the love they had found again, even when the odds were against them. One spring morning, as she strolled through the garden, Laura paused by the oak tree. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. the gentle breeze that carried with it the scent of blooming flowers. In that moment, she felt Richard's presence more strongly than she had in days. She could almost feel his hand in hers, the reassurance of his touch. And for the first time since his passing, she smiled. Not a smile tinged with sadness, but one filled with peace, acceptance, and quiet joy. "Thank you." "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves, "for everything." She turned back toward the house, her steps light, her heart full. She knew that their love had not ended. It had merely transformed. It was now woven into every part of her, into the person she had become. It lived on in the way she saw the world, in the kindness she extended to others, in the beauty she sought every day. Their love was not a thing of the past. It was her constant companion. It was there in the laughter she shared with others, in the stories she told, in the moments of stillness when she felt the world around her. And as she looked up at the sky that night, the stars just beginning to twinkle in the vast darkness, she knew he was there too, shining down on her, his love as endless as the sky above. Laura's journey had not ended with Richard's passing. It had merely shifted, taken a new form. She had found her forever. Not in a future they could share, but in the present moments that she carried within her, in the simple, enduring truth that love, true love, never really ends. It lives on, in memories, in actions, in the very fabric of who we are. As the stars blinked down at her, Laura smiled, her heart swelling with an overwhelming sense of peace. Richard was gone, but his love remained, guiding her, comforting her, reminding her that theirs was a love that truly lived on, beyond time, beyond loss, forever. As the seasons shifted, Laura settled into a new rhythm of life, one woven with solitude and profound gratitude. Each morning, she wandered through the garden, watching flowers bloom and fade, feeling Richard's presence in every petal, every whisper of the wind. She kept his notebook close, often reading his words as if he were there beside her, each line a reminder that his love still surrounded her. These small, sacred rituals became her way of honoring him, grounding her in a love that refused to diminish. Gradually, Laura began to notice how Richard's spirit seemed to linger, not just as a memory, but as a gentle guide urging her forward. In her reflections, she realized that their love story wasn't just for her to hold. It was a story meant to be shared. A story that could heal and inspire others. She began to write, pouring her heart onto the page, every memory and emotion a testament to the resilience of love. At first, it was simply her private sanctuary, a place to put her longing and gratitude into words. But soon, Laura felt a growing sense of purpose. Their love story might bring hope to those who felt lost, those searching for proof that love endures beyond the limits of time and circumstance. After months of quiet dedication, Laura completed the manuscript. She titled it, "Forever, With You," echoing the words Richard had whispered in their final moments together. It felt like a fitting tribute, a way to immortalize their journey, each chapter a piece of their shared heart. When the book was finally published, the response took Laura by surprise. Letters began to arrive from readers, people who had found solace in her words, who thanked her for reminding them that love could persist even in loss. The letters were filled with gratitude and stories of their own, lost loves, second chances, and the comfort her story had given them. These responses became part of Laura's healing, reinforcing her sense of purpose and transforming her grief into something beautiful and enduring. One day, Laura was invited to give a reading at a local community event. Standing before an audience, her heart swelled with both pride and tenderness. As she read an excerpt from her book, she spoke of the love that had shaped her life, the years they had missed, and the moments they had cherished. Her voice wavered, but she felt an inner calm, as if Richard were there with her, his spirit steadying her, reminding her that their story mattered. After the reading, an elderly woman approached Laura, her eyes warm and glistening with tears. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice filled with emotion. "Your story reminded me of my own lost love. It helped me see beyond the pain, to remember the joy we shared, and I cannot thank you enough for that." Laura smiled, tears welling in her eyes, and gently clasped the woman's hands. In that moment, she understood the true purpose of her journey. Richard had always wanted her to live fully, to embrace the world with the love they had shared. Now she was doing just that, sharing her heart so that others might heal. It wasn't only her story, it belonged to anyone who had ever loved deeply, lost, and found the courage to love again. In the months that followed, Laura continued to share her story, both through her book and through her presence. She found joy in connecting with others, in being a source of comfort for those who needed it most. Each time she shared their story, she felt a little more of Richard's spirit flow through her, guiding her with the strength of their love. On the anniversary of Richard's passing, Laura returned to the oak tree, their tree. She carried a single white rose, its petals soft and luminous. Kneeling at the base of the tree, she placed the rose gently on the ground. The quiet of the garden enveloped her, the soft rustle of the leaves a lullaby that seemed to speak to her heart. "Thank you, Richard," she whispered, her eyes closed. Feeling the breeze caress her face, "for everything, for loving me, for teaching me that true love never fades, and for giving me the courage to carry on." As she sat there, a warmth settled over her, a feeling of being held, as though Richard's arms were wrapped around her in one final embrace. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But they weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of love that had transformed her life and left her forever changed. When she finally rose to leave, Laura felt lighter, as if the weight of her grief had given way to something else, something infinite and enduring. She turned toward the house. The sky above a brilliant blue, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. She knew that Richard's presence would always be with her, that his love was a part of her, woven into every breath, every word she spoke, every act of kindness she shared. Laura had found her purpose, and she knew that it was one she and Richard had created together. It wasn't about forgetting or moving on, but about living fully, carrying the love they had shared into every moment of her life. She was no longer afraid of the future. Instead, she embraced it with open arms, knowing that she carried the best part of him with her. And as she looked up at the sky, the stars just beginning to twinkle, Laura smiled. She knew Richard was there, shining beside her, watching over her, a love that would remain as endless and bright as the stars above. Their story was not just one of loss. It was a testament to the power of love to endure, to inspire, and to live on in every life it touched. And in that knowledge, she found peace, a peace that reminded her every day that their love truly was forever. In the years that followed, Laura continued to live a life filled with love, gratitude, and purpose. She remained deeply connected to the memory of Richard, his love serving as a guiding light in everything she did. Each morning, she walked through the garden, feeling the serenity beneath the old oak tree where so many promises were made and memories created. The home they had once shared became a place of warmth and welcome, a haven not just for her, but for family, friends, and even strangers who found solace in her presence. Laura's book, Forever With You, became a quiet success, touching hearts across the globe. She received letters from readers thanking her for sharing her journey, for reminding them that love could endure beyond loss, beyond time itself. Each message was a testament to Richard's enduring presence. And through these connections, Laura found herself with a new community, people who, like her, had loved deeply, lost profoundly, and found hope again. One crisp autumn morning, Laura received an invitation from a local support organization to lead a workshop for those coping with loss. They wanted her to share her story of resilience and finding purpose after heartbreak. Accepting the invitation felt like a natural step. She knew that this was how she could continue Richard's legacy, offering comfort and understanding in the same way he would have wanted her to. On the day of the workshop, Laura stood before a room full of people, each face marked by quiet strength and a shared vulnerability. She began by sharing her journey of love, separation, reunion, and ultimately loss. She spoke of the lessons Richard had taught her and the love that had given her purpose. As she looked around the room, she saw that her words resonated with those present, as if her journey became a mirror reflecting their own hopes, grief, and resilience. Afterward, a young woman approached Laura, holding a copy of her book with trembling hands. "Your story," she began, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "It reminded me that it's okay to love again, even after losing someone so deeply. Thank you." Laura's eyes misted and she smiled, feeling Richard's presence in that moment. He had always wanted her to live fully, to share her love with the world. And now, in helping others find their way through the darkness, she felt she was honoring him in the truest sense. Later that evening, Laura sat by her window, sipping warm tea as she looked up at the stars, glimmering like promises against the velvet sky. She could almost feel Richard there with her, his spirit close, sharing in the peace of that moment. She whispered softly, "Thank you, Richard, for teaching me that love doesn't end, but grows, touching others and changing the world." A gentle breeze moved through the open window, rustling the curtains. Laura smiled, feeling at peace, as if Richard had sent her an answer. The love she and Richard had shared was no longer confined to memories. It had grown, reaching out to others, giving them hope. She knew that her heart was still open to whatever the future held, just as Richard would have wanted. In the days that followed, Laura continued to write, travel, and share her story. She dedicated herself to living with an open heart, embracing the beauty of life and all its uncertainties. Her journey had taught her that love, once shared, was never truly lost. It transformed, grew, and found new ways to exist, always reaching further than she could have imagined. Years passed, and Laura found herself surrounded by a life rich in love, friends who became family, new bonds formed through shared experience, and strangers who had become confidants. She had become a symbol of resilience, her journey a testament to the enduring power of love. Richard's memory remained her anchor, yet her spirit was free, open to the joy that each new day brought. In her final days, as Laura sat beneath the old oak tree, she felt only gratitude. She had lived a full life, a life of love and meaning. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun and the rustling of leaves above her. She knew that when her time came, she would be ready with no regrets, only love. And as her breathing slowed and her world grew quiet, Laura felt Richard's presence surrounding her, as if he had been waiting all along. She smiled, knowing that the love they had shared was guiding her home. Together, reunited in a love that had never truly ended, they began a new journey, one that would last forever.